Pro cyclists keep reducing their crank length. Tour de France winners Tadej Pogacar and Jonas Vingegaard are going shorter and shorter. A quick search online and you'll uncover a ton of different opinions on this topic, including my own on this very channel. But I feel I still haven't put the short crank debate to bed. I was still very much on the fence. So in this video, I've dug deeper for answers. I've switched from my usual 175mm cranks all the way down to 165mm for 1,000 kilometers. Along the way, I've also spoken to Dr Borut Fonda, the man who is said to have inspired Tadej Pogacar to go shorter too. Is this change something that I and perhaps you should consider? Game changer or fad? 1,000 kilometers later, will I keep my short cranks? I've got to say, at the start of this journey, I was pretty nervous about doing this. Changing my crank length is something I've always kind of avoided, mainly because of the faff and the expense, because it's not an easy change to make, like raising your saddle height or even just swapping out for a different size stem. So it's something that I'd thought about doing, but just didn't think that faff was worth it. Until recently, when I felt like I could potentially get some benefits in terms of comfort from what I was reading, what I was hearing from other people about shorter cranks. So I decided that now was time to really give it a try. So to get the ball rolling, FSA kitted me out with their K-Force Team Edition crankset in a size 165mm. That's 10mm shorter than my usual crank size, 12.5mm shorter than the size I preferred when I was a pro. Gearing, I've gone for a 50-34. Now that is something you really need to pay attention with when you do change your crank size. And if you go shorter, you need to compensate for that by going for easier gears. That is something that you can fall foul of. I'm not going to go in depth in the maths and the physics behind this. There are plenty of resources out there to get your calculations right, depending on the size you're going for and to match your gearing up to what you're used to. But do pay attention to that if you are changing. At the start of my short crank journey, basically it felt really weird and unnatural to be deliberately fitting these cranks to my bike, because as someone who's over 2 meters tall, 6'8", I always choose the biggest size of anything. That's just like been blanket, what I've always done my whole life. So to deliberately choose something smaller, it just felt wrong. But then at the same time, I have actually been riding my mountain bike a lot recently. You might have noticed that. It's up on GMBN. You can check that film out now if you want. And that bike does have slightly smaller cranks fitted as standard. Out of the comfort zone. I've also been riding the Zwift Ride Smart bike quite a lot recently, and that comes fitted with 170mm cranks as standard. You can now get different options, but then at the time, the riding I've been doing over the winter, that's what I was using, and it actually felt really nice, felt amazing. So the jump to 165 seemed doable. I also went that short because Jonas Vingegaard was spotted on 150mm cranks at the start of the season. Relatively, in terms of body height, we've both made kind of roughly similar jumps. So my thinking was, if it worked for him, it could potentially work for me. But I really wanted to understand what was going on here with this trend from a bike fit perspective. So I reached out to Dr Borut Fonda to get his take on the topic. Now, he is said to have persuaded Tadej Pogacar to embrace shorter cranks. So he seemed like the perfect person to get his opinion from.
So I'm Borut Fonda from Slovenia. I have a PhD in cycling biomechanics, motor control. Currently working with Absolute Black as a lead scientist and also having my own laboratory here in Slovenia, where I work with a lot of ultra riders to get them fit on the bike and optimize their performance.
Just like to make in really simple terms then, what do you think is going on in the body when it comes to bike fit when you move to shorter cranks? What is it about that change that is allowing a rider to save energy or ride more efficiently?
So it's mainly the efficiency, and the reason for that is multifactorial, I would say. And we mainly speak around biomechanics, and yes, we can open the hip and so on. But one of the things from motor control point of view is they are able to direct the force more effectively than they are with the shorter cranks. But the other very important aspect is it's more physiological. It's not even biomechanical, and it's got to do with the iliac artery. So especially with the blood flow resistance of the external iliac artery. For example, the more flexion in the hip, so the more close the hip is, the sharper the turn of the iliac artery is, and the more turbulent flow of this oxygen-rich blood to the leg is. The other thing that happens is the pedal is being moved backwards when the crank is at 3 o'clock. So that allows a more perpendicular force direction to the crank, and at the most important part of the crank cycle, so at between 90 and 110, where you have peak power output. So basically, it's like moving the saddle forward, like what triathletes are doing. Cyclists are not allowed because of the regulations from the UCI, but we actually achieve the same thing by shortening the cranks.
And can you go too short when it comes to crank length? Like, is there kind of an optimal limit, or is there a potential point when there's a disadvantage or a drawback to using a shorter crank?
So again, it's not one size fits all approach. So I don't want to answer that. It works for everyone. At the moment, especially in Pro Tour, we're limited by the manufacturer's ability to supply what's the shortest crank. So we don't have, especially in the World Tour, when they're sponsored by obviously group set manufacturers, they don't supply 145 or 155 and so on. Although we have seen now some of the modifications among the best riders in the world to go even shorter than 165. But I strongly believe the whole trend in the next 5 years is going to move towards 160.
It was really interesting to talk to Borut Fonda and get his thoughts on crank length. And I found I could really relate to everything he was saying. It was like ticking all the boxes in my head. But my first big test riding these was when I headed to Taiwan with Ollie for a film that you can watch on the channel right now. If you haven't watched it, please do if you get a chance. But for those who have, and the eagle-eyed amongst you would have spotted that I was using these cranks on my bike. I'd used them a bit before and I'd got used to the position. I'd changed it by raising my saddle a little bit. I hadn't changed the setback because the saddle height actually took that into consideration already. But I was still apprehensive because it was such a big ride and I didn't kind of want to ruin it by just throwing my position off and not feeling right. And the first hour or two felt pretty strange, I must admit. It took a little bit to get used to, but then after a while it just felt natural and it felt like there was no difference really. But all the differences that I did feel were positive ones. So I felt like my pedaling style felt much smoother. Those dead spots that you sometimes feel, and when you get really tired as well, and you feel like you're pedaling squares, it's really hard to explain, but I just didn't feel that as much. I also had no saddle sores whatsoever. I felt less stiffness off the bike in the evenings in my joints, which you potentially normally feel after like 8 or 10 hours on the bike, which is what we were doing over there. I also felt like I could hold a more aggressive position for longer on the bike. I felt more comfortable and I didn't feel like I was limited at the front. And these are all things that I've kind of struggled with since I've stopped racing and riding full time. But the big one for me is some lower back issues which I've suffered from and have been quite hard to keep on top of since I stopped racing. And that just vanished straight away. It was incredible. It just totally fixed it. And I found I could really, really enjoy my riding. And it just felt great to feel more flexible on the bike. So after Taiwan, these were like, I was sold. Coming back from Taiwan, I was obviously then pretty much in the short crank camp. And I began swapping shorter cranks onto most of the bikes that I'm lucky enough to ride here on the channel, including my Pinarello. And I tell you what, because I was riding the shorter cranks all the time, I actually just didn't even notice that they're any shorter. It's amazing how your body does adapt. I even raced the Tracker 200 on a Canyon Grail fitted with shorter cranks, and again, all the positives I've mentioned already came out to play, and I felt just super comfortable. It felt natural. It felt like I was in the short crank camp, good and proper. But then I'm mainly just talking about feel here and comfort. I still haven't quite managed to pinpoint whether there's any sort of performance gain from going shorter, which could be tangible or measurable. Now, for me, it doesn't really matter. I don't mind if there is or there isn't, because the fact that I feel so much more comfortable riding my bike and enjoying it more as a result, that was the real benefit for me. But I was still really curious to see what sort of impact the shorter cranks may have on my ability to put down as much power as possible through the pedals. So I've decided to come up with a few little experiments to put that to the test. Before I get into those tests though, what must be said is that when I was racing professionally, I feel like the best season I ever had was when I used longer cranks, 177.5 mil. The reason for this, I do feel is quite niche, because I was racing a lot in Northern Europe, very steep cobble climbs, where positioning is really key. And what happens in those races a lot of the time is that the bunch kind of concertinas, and you have this like effect where you'll stop, you'll start, and it can be quite hard to change gear on a cobble climb. So often you do end up riding and racing at a slightly lower cadence. And I found that longer cranks really helped with leverage in that situation. It allowed me to get on top of the gear quicker. It meant I could really stay glued to the wheel in front, and I didn't like open the door for someone then to sneak in and take my place, which allows you to really work on your positioning, which has this knock-on effect of allowing you to perform better. That is obviously a very, very niche advantage to longer cranks. But interestingly, it's something that Fonda actually explained to me that he'd heard from other riders as well who are racing in similar situations. What's your opinion on longer cranks? Because like I always feel like my best season, as when I was racing professionally, I moved to longer cranks. I went to 177.5. I was racing predominantly in Northern Europe on like cobbled races, these short, steep climbs. It's very stop-start in the bunch. Then I preferred long cranks. So I'm really interested to know what your opinion is on them, because they still exist.
What you're describing actually holds true at extremely low cadences with low crank inertial load, or for example, standing start. But when you have cadences above 1670, which is still fairly low, this effect of a longer lever, more torque becomes totally neglectable. Not to mention that the force direction during the upstroke, so the second phase of the cycling, you're actually pushing downwards during steady state cycling. And you minimize the effect of the longer lever by counter effect on the other side. So I had a few riders reporting on riding the monuments, the big classics, the cobbled classics with steep climbs, that they have this extra push with longer cranks at the very end of the climb when the cadence drops below their average. They said with shorter cranks, they weren't able to keep the momentum. Now we can argue that you just shift the gear and go with higher cadence. But in most of the cases, if the riders are adapted to this style of racing, like the Belgian classics, that would probably not be the best idea. So in that case, I would maybe support just stick with not longer, but normal crank length.
I do think it was for that reason I was always persuaded against even experimenting with shorter cranks, because it always felt like I was getting on really well with longer cranks in that specific situation that I was training for and racing for. But now I've really been won over by the argument for shorter cranks by the likes of Dr Borut Fonda and also expert bike fitter Phil Burt, who's always tried to get me to try shorter cranks. And I do feel it's that comfort argument, the fact that I felt like my bike fit is so much better afterwards. I feel like I can transfer power better, there's less fatigue as well. All the reasons that I've been going through in this video, that for me is why I personally would stick to shorter cranks. There's definitely a kind of learning curve you need when you go to them, and that is in terms of gearing. You need to make sure you have easier gears at your disposal, and you do need to think more about your gear changes. You can't be lazy and get stuck in the wrong gear, because it is a little harder to get out of it. So as long as you pay attention to that and get used to that, you really can just use your gears to adapt for the difference in the length of cranks and that difference in leverage, and then it really has no effect. So as things stand now, I'm definitely sticking to shorter cranks. I'm going for them on all my bikes, but at the same time, I'm also really curious to see if it's had any sort of effect on my actual performance, numbers-wise. So now it is time to get kitted up, get on the bike, and see what those numbers look like.
So first up, I'm going to be putting my short power to the test, short-term power, sprint. And if anything, this is the area where I think potentially I might be a bit lower than before. But at the same time, for the riding I've done so far, I have felt like my upper body is much more stable when I am sprinting, because you're not pedaling as big a circles, so it's easy to keep stable on the bike. But then again, shorter levers, will that make much difference in putting out the power from a lower cadence? There's only one way to find out. So I'm to sprint as hard as I can, 5 seconds. Best power is around 1400 watts for this in the past. Let's see what I can do today.
Sprint's done. I'm now getting straight on the bike indoors this time, but I'm heading to Zwift. I'm going to do the grade climb. I've done this so many times in a few videos on this channel already, and it's just for me a really good benchmark for my own power values. I know how to pace it this time. I know the sort of effort needed, so I'm going to give it my absolute best. Let's get into it. I'm in the same relative shape. Let's do it. Give it my best, so I can learn anything afterwards. Here we go. 8.7%, 3.6k. Tighten the old bootstraps. Last corner. Oh man, that's painful. Actually, I'm gonna go through the numbers in a second once I recovered, and just kind of draw my own conclusions from this jump to short cranks, and look at those numbers. But just first thoughts, I think I actually surprised myself a bit there. I was kind of totally in the dark because I haven't, as I said, been looking at my power data throughout this. It's really been a question of feel and getting used to riding a bike in a different way, and changing your crank plane really does have that effect, I think. It's almost like changing your footprint, so to speak. So doing that all-out effort there is like, felt different. Whew. But yeah, let's recover, towel off, go through that data and draw some conclusions. Right then, I've done my power test, I've done my 1,000 kilometers on short cranks. What have I learnt from this change? Well, let's start with that power data at the end there, because the sprint test, when you look at that, I think there's no real kind of noticeable difference between those efforts I did today and my previous bests from the years gone by. Maybe you could argue it was a little bit down, but it's not enough for me to be like, and in terms of feeling as well, to be saying I didn't feel like I could get as much power out with the shorter cranks compared to the longer cranks. And I think that's the same when you look at my efforts up the grade climb there, because at one point I thought I was going to do a PB. I've done plenty of efforts up this climb this year. It wasn't a PB, so I did 443 watts, 165 beats per minute heart rate. My best this year is 462 watts, 166 beats per minute heart rate. Time, you're talking, it's about 50 seconds slower. So it's a little bit down, but still you've got to take into account, it's not scientific, you've got to take into account my fatigue on the day, what I've been doing the last few days, it all adds up. And for me, that isn't like, I felt good during the effort, I felt like I could put the power down, I didn't feel like the short cranks were responsible for that drop in power. And really, that's like, I personally feel that's pretty comparable. And if you look at some of the research that's been done out there on crank length, it does point to the fact that there really is no difference in power when you change crank length. So for me, doing those tests actually back up my own feeling at the end of all this, that I'm sticking with shorter cranks. I'm actually really interested to go even shorter and see what effect that has on my riding. I don't feel like it has slowed me down. I think it's made me more comfortable on the bike. I feel it's actually optimized my bike fit too, because I've been able to get that kind of feeling of being more over the bottom bracket without compromising my reach, because I'm getting to the bottom bracket by reducing my crank length rather than bringing my saddle forward. Also, I feel like when I do longer rides, I feel less fatigued in terms of like my joints, muscle pain when I get later on in that ride. So that's another thing that's quite hard to measure, but it's more of a subjective thing that I've really personally felt. And yeah, it's been an eye-opening one for me. I'm like definitely keeping on the shorter cranks. I'm going to keep on riding for the rest of the year, see how it goes. But yeah, like I've already said in this video, I felt like I really enjoyed my riding after switching to shorter cranks. And I'd be really interested to hear from you all too. Have you experimented with your crank length long term? Have you switched to shorter cranks, or perhaps you've gone longer? Let me know in the comments. It'd be great to get your thoughts. And I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep up to date with what we've got going on. Thanks for watching, as always, and I'll see you on the next one with shorter cranks.